Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Roberts as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Elizabeth Roberts is a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan, whose work sits at the intersection of science, society, and lived experience. Her research examines how scientific and public health knowledge is produced and how it shapes bodies, environments, and everyday life across Latin America and the United States. She leads Mexican Exposures, an interdisciplinary initiative bringing together social scientists, engineers, and environmental health researchers to explore how inequality is embedded in biological and ecological systems in Mexico City. Through this work, Dr. Elizabeth advances bioethnography, an innovative approach that blends social and life sciences to better understand health and inequality as deeply interconnected processes. Her earlier scholarship explored assisted reproduction, reproductive governance, and transnational medical practices, culminating in her acclaimed book, Goat's Laboratory, Assisted Reproduction in the Andes. In today's episode, Dr. Elizabeth Roberts explores the core ideas from her influential book, In Praise of Addiction, or How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World, offering a transformative perspective on addiction, one that reframes it as a pathway to understanding connection through the very pleasures we often consider harmful. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Roberts to the conversation. Professor Elizabeth, thank you for accepting our invitation. It's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your book begins with deeply personal experiences of addiction within your family and yourself. How did this shape your initial understanding of addiction and what began to shift that perspective?
Um, so the book is organized around narratives about my family, including my own uh, struggles with addiction that I brought with me when I started doing work in Mexico City. And what the book then really starts off with is me working and living in mostly working class neighborhoods in Mexico City, where I learned that people had a very different relationship to this thing we call addiction. And I would say that at first, I couldn't really hear or experience or absorb what people were sharing with me because my own sense of addiction was that addiction is just inherently a problem. We know that addiction in the United States since the late 19th century, we know addiction is a pathological state, that people who are compulsively dependent on substances or can't stop certain behaviors like to gambling have a problem. And that problem needs to be kind of understood and fixed by physicians or psychologists, and people need to work on themselves to stop being addicts. So when my neighbors started kind of sharing with me just through everyday life, that for them, addiction was a binding force, something that held them together with others. I just, in some ways, didn't understand what I was seeing or experiencing at all. And it took me quite a long time to really see that or to apprehend that people did have this very different way of experiencing addiction. And then it took me a longer time to notice what they were actually saying about the binding power of addiction. They were also sharing with me that when compulsive dependencies took them away from other people, they called that vice, and that was considered the thing that was problematic, not the addiction itself. It was whether or not you did it with people, you experienced your addiction alone or with others. So it took me quite a long time to really understand this, and that's what often happens with anthropologists. Things emerge in their field work when they're doing other things that are not something they were looking for. And as I came to understand this, I wanted to figure out if I could apply what I was learning in Mexico City to my own family's struggles with addiction. And in fact, that's what a lot of the book is. The whole last third of the book is taking the lessons I learned in Mexico City and kind of turning addiction on its head, saying, what if we thought of this as potentially a binding force, and trying to see what that would look like if I analyzed or understood my own family's experiences of addiction in this way. So, in specific, that meant rethinking my sister's relationship to alcohol and prescription medications, rethinking my own relationship to food, rethinking my mother's relationship to hoarding. And there's a lot of other examples in the book where I try to think about what if we didn't shame people inherently for addiction, but paid more attention to what addiction does and if it could connect us to others or if it takes us away from other people.
Professor, you described a turning point during your fieldwork in Mexico City. What did you observe that there challenged the dominant narrative of addiction as purely a personal failure?
Right. So the book, there's several of these moments in the book, but I would say a very key one is something I described quite at the near the beginning. It's actually the introduction of the book. I'm living at that point with a family. So this is my landlady basically and her family, and this is an extended family household. And I'm just going to pause there for a moment to say that unlike most of the households I had lived in the United States, my neighbors in Mexico City lived in extended family households. There's uh, what we would call grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren, all living together in the same household. And this meant that people didn't have quite the same amount of privacy that I was used to coming from the United States. And one morning, I was barely awake, and my landlord, I call him Clemente, he starts knocking on my window and begging for a drink. And it's, I think it was like 7 in the morning, very, very early. And to me, someone begging for a drink at 7 in the morning, there's something wrong there, right? And I didn't know what to do. And I run across the courtyard of this terreno or compound, household compound, and knock on the door of his son and wife's part of the household. And there's a few separate households around a courtyard. And his granddaughter answers, who's 5. And I ask her to tell her mother that her grandfather is, begging for alcohol. And the granddaughter's mother tells her to get her a drink, to get him a drink, Clemente a drink. And this 5-year-old then pours him a glass of tequila and gives him a drink. And it seems like, oh, she's done this before. And then she sits with him on the embankment in the courtyard and he drinks it and then he gives her the glass back and they both go back into their respective houses. And later that day, my landlady, Dolores, comes to see if I'm okay. And I think she knows that probably this is somewhat unsettling, but I don't think she knew quite how unsettling it was. Because I came from this place where someone begging for alcohol at 7 in the morning is a problem. And just like my sister was an alcoholic at that time, and we were always trying to cast her out or not let her have alcohol or send her away. And when I asked her what I should do if this happened again, she said, well, just give him a drink. And I couldn't at that point really understand what she was telling me. But what I observed over time is that Dolores and her family were never cast Clemente out for needing or being dependent on alcohol. And in fact, they called themselves alcoholics. They drank a fair amount. But what was different for them about their own drinking, which was extensive, and Clemente's drinking, was that often when he drank, he would take himself off and be alone. And this was the thing that was the problem, his desire to be alone, not that he was drinking or not that he was inebriated. And again, they live in a very different world or ecology than I did, where what being a productive member of society is somewhat different. And in some ways, there was more care in an extended family household to take care of things when Clemente couldn't do what he was supposed to do. But it was shocking to me, and then productively shocking, that over time I could see that not casting him out made it so that he was not as aggressive or abusive as my sister became, as we constantly tried to take alcohol away from her and constantly cast her out or stop talking to her because she was doing something that we found so unacceptable. And I would say part of the unacceptability is that when someone in the United States is an addict, it's very threatening to those of us who are working so hard to demonstrate that we are productive individuals that are not dependent on anything. So we need to cast people out because it's hitting close to home. Like, what if I become like that? And in fact, I had my own relationship to compulsive dependency on food that I think my sister's alcoholism really, stressed me out. I don't want to see someone who doesn't have control over themselves in relation to substances. And I'll just say one more time, or kind of reiterate, Dolores and her family, I think, didn't feel like they needed to control themselves in relation to substances. They don't need to demonstrate that they are independent. And for that reason, Clemente drinking wasn't a stressful situation necessarily. What was stressful, again, was that he isolated themselves. And that was what was inexplicable for them.
Professor, the idea of people celebrating their dependencies rather than hiding them is striking. What
Mhm.
does this reveal about the social nature of addiction?
Yes, well, I think when we think about addiction in the United States, at least, addiction can, well, think about how, oh, people can be addicts in groups, like, oh, there's alcoholics, or group, the social encourages things like addiction. But we often think about addiction as something that is an individual's problem. Like, oh, there's a lot of people drinking, but if you're an addict, that's your problem that you need to fix. You need to stop drinking or not be with these people. And something like Alcoholics Anonymous, which has been a very powerful approach to dealing with struggles with alcohol, helps create community that is focused on not drinking. So it produces another form of sociality. What I experienced in these neighborhoods in Mexico City was that for people, alcohol was something to be celebrated or addiction was something to be celebrated because it brought people together. It bound them together in their shared compulsive relationship to this thing. Another way to talk about it is devotion. And it was very similar to the way that people were devoted to saints or to God, or the Virgin Mary, that they didn't have control over their devotion to their loved ones, to a particular saint like the Virgen de Guadalupe or Saint Jude, for instance, and they didn't have control over their relationship to alcohol. But as long it was as that devotion was producing intensified forms of sociality, that was something praiseworthy. It's devotion. We praise devotion. We devotion, is what I was just saying. It produces all this connectivity. And again, the thing that was so inexplicable was when devotion to a substance like alcohol took people away, that didn't produce these other forms of devotion to each other. And that was the thing that wasn't as praiseworthy.
Professor, you argue that addiction is not just individual but ecological. Can you
Mhm.
explain what an ecological framework of addiction look like in practice?
Yeah, I'm very happy you brought that up. One of the things that I try very carefully to show is that even though I think that there's much that's useful from what I learned in Mexico City about how people are living addiction as this praiseworthy phenomenon that holds people together, and that we could really use that to think about how we pathologize addiction in the United States. We can't wholeheartedly, or we can't just move that addiction over to the United States because our ecologies are so different. So, like I said, most of the folks that I talk about in Mexico City live in extended family households that are I mean, they're just never-endingly social, right? People share bedrooms, but they're sharing space with pets, but also saints. You can't really hide your addictions because everybody knows what you're doing. And people share things in very different ways than I was used to in the United States. For instance, people shared cell phones and earbuds and Facebook accounts and other forms of social media. They shared food. When people would talk to me or learn that I would sometimes eat alone in my little house, they would start crying because it's just so weird to imagine doing these things by yourself. It's like deeply, deeply, that was what was deeply kind of problematic for them. So when I started to try to think about how could I apply what I'm learning about addiction in Mexico City to the US, and how can I apply this distinction between addiction and vice, the compulsions that hold you together versus the compulsions that separate you, I realized I couldn't do it because fully. I mean, I could do it, but because I spend so much time alone, and so many of us in the United States do. We might live alone. Many people live alone, but also even if we don't live alone, people have their own bedrooms or this a lot of alone time. Children have their own bedrooms. Even people who are in some kind of partnership often might have a study or some place to go alone, right? And like right now, I'm sitting in my study and people don't bother me. And so, if I was to say that addiction is something that binds you with other people in this kind of social frame, then it would be hard to think about anything in the United States as an addiction. Everything would be a vice because we're alone all the time. And I think that us being alone allows us to engage in these compulsions, but because we're so worried about dependency, we are shamed of being alone with our dependencies, the fact that we can't control ourselves and we're alone. And it kind of feeds on itself. It's like the more I do this alone, the more I'm going to do this alone because I don't want anyone to know how compulsive I am. So that's, I mean, there's many other different ecologies, but I think that's a very important one. And so by the end of the book, I start thinking about how if I framed, for instance, my compulsive eating, especially sugar, as something that was praiseworthy, and I maybe need to do it alone because I do live alone or because, I want to gobble food in a particular way, I could start thinking about how I didn't need to have shame with that, and it would help me be among others and not be so ashamed of the fact that I had, eaten a whole carton of ice cream by myself or even with others. It also allowed me to think about, well, maybe I don't have to be ashamed and I could do this with others. But the main thing was is I couldn't call all of my compulsive dependencies vices because everything again would be advice. It paying attention to the different ecology helped me pay attention to how shame is such a big part of what our ecology is of solitary addiction in the United States. And could we change that ecology a little bit by changing our relationship to shame or our changing our shame in relationship to these addictions?
Professor, how do systems like NAFTA, the drug war, and global food industries actively shape patterns of addiction in communities?
Yes. So this book is for a broad audience, people who care about addiction, which is a lot of people in the and in many ways, I'm writing the book to readers in the United States who assume addiction is pathological and who are probably ashamed of their addictions. And I'm trying to show them what my neighbors in Mexico City, how they're living kind of in joy with addictions and concerned about the solitude of vice. But to do that, I have to give some history, some context. And if you're a reader in the United States or potentially in India, I hope people in India write it, you might not know that much about how the landscape of, say, food and sugar and the availability of processed foods has changed so dramatically in Mexico due to the North American Free Trade Act. So I had to talk a lot about how NAFTA made it so that access to cheap, abundantly caloric processed foods became ubiquitous after the North American Free Trade Act. And that meant that things like soda, which people would share with me they're very addicted to, became very cheap, especially Coca-Cola. And Mexico became the number one consumer of soda, but especially Coca-Cola products in the world. And there's a complex story of why that's so. But one of the things that I felt like my neighbors were so uh, insightful about is that they would then help me see that their addiction to soda, to Coca-Cola, wasn't an individual failing, but had a lot to do with a political economic change, a change in the business landscape. And this thing podcast is called Businesstalk, but a change in the trade relations between the United States and Mexico that made it that it almost made it makes so much more sense to drink soda than to drink water. And this can have all kinds of harmful impact, like very, very high rates of diabetes, which I know also is a huge issue in India as well. But my neighbors didn't think about their addiction to soda as a personal failing, but more a change in the political economic landscape, the business landscape of Mexico. And then there's a similar thing at work in terms of the drug war. And it's complex to talk about this. The drug war was really, fueled and started through this relationship between the United States and Mexico. And there's a lot of really good reporting on how the drug war is very much not really there to fight drugs, but to allow for more integration between the military and governments in the United States and in different nations in Latin America. And so there's all these other trade relations like supplying guns and things like that. And you can use the drug war as a pretense to control and police groups of people. You can say we're in war with the cartels in Mexico, but we can also incarcerate lots of people in the United States, especially African Americans, or in the 60s, it was like we can imprison the hippies who were also fighting who were against the Vietnam War. And so you can use the drug war as a pretense to do all kinds of things. You also can use it as a way to change legal systems. And the changes in the legal systems in Mexico relate back to NAFTA. So the drug war allowed for a different way of allowing corporations to be less regulated in Mexico. It actually took up a very similar legal structure to the United States. And it meant that you couldn't really, you stopped being able to hold corporations into account. So that allows for more sales of things like soda and sugary beverages and a kind of a deregulation, a deregulatory landscape in all kinds of ways. So, I mean, that's kind of the background of all of these political and economic changes. And then I also really could see that this drug war that was fought in the name of quelling addiction and making drugs not so available was something that my neighbors in these working class areas, didn't think it had anything to do with making anyone safer. It just created more violence. And so it was a way that they were somewhat defiant against what the drug war is officially about. And it was a way that it made them start saying, we're addicted to the things we're not supposed to be addicted to, like alcohol, or shopping or sugar. And I think it, it, they were constantly juxtaposing the joy and deliciousness of something like sugar and the violence of the drug war that is in the name of fighting addiction. I would also say that in Mexico, the prevalence of drug use or things like overdose has been very relatively low, and the rates of death from diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which I also know are big issues in India, are exponentially higher than any kind of cause of death or even disability from drugs. So when people talk about being addicted to Coca-Cola, they're actually talking about something that has very high stakes. They or many of their loved ones have diabetes, and they know that soda relates to diabetes. So it's not like they think that it's a light thing to say that they're addicted to soda. But they are being quite defiant of the terms of the drug war as they're set up, that we should not be addicts.
Professor, you draw a distinction between vice that isolates and addiction that connects. Could you unpack this idea and how it changes the way we think about dependency?
Yes. So I've already mentioned this a few times, but it's nice to be able to go into it a little deeper. Um, so, like I said, for my neighbors, addiction were these compulsive dependencies that held people together. They were things that then you were devoted to in devotion with other people. And vice were so, and it could be anything. You know, you could be devoted to alcohol, you could be devoted to drugs. One of the drugs that was very common in these neighborhoods is a kind of pipe glue solvent called Activo, and it's like huffing glue. You could be addicted to that. You could be addicted to selling Tupperware. As long as you were doing it in a group and it created this kind of like devotional feeling between people, that was an addiction and it was worthy of celebration. Vice, on the other hand, you could be devoted to it, consumed by it, dependent on it, but it made you leave the group. That was something that was very, very worrisome. And, you know, it wasn't an inherent thing. Like someone who left their family and went and drank with buddies, they might feel that they're in addiction with those drinking buddies, but the family might feel like they were isolated in vice because the person who had the vice had left them. So there wasn't kind of a way to talk about it, you know, as a universal subject, or like God wouldn't look down and decide something was an addiction or vice. And just like addiction, vice could be anything. It could be so one person could be addicted to alcohol and another person could be lost in the vice of alcohol. And there wasn't a substance that was inherently more addictive or likely to cause vice. The way that this helps us rethink dependency, and I'm basing this from my own locatedness in the United States. In the United States, we have such a long-standing disdain, anxiety, fear about dependency. We think people are supposed to be independent. That's a sign of a true adult, is independence. And in Mexico City, my neighbors, they felt the exact opposite. To be an adult is to be embedded in as many dependencies as possible. It's to rely on other members of your family or your community and to have them rely on you. So it's to be enmeshed in as many dependencies as possible. And I think this is why there's nothing inherently stressful about or anxiety producing about addiction itself, because it's yet another dependency. So it's again getting those of us in the United States who think addiction is a problem because it causes dependency to potentially rethink what we think is just so inherently wrong with addiction itself. Because my neighbors in Mexico City located a problem, if there was one, in the fact of solitude, not dependency. And there's several examples of this throughout the book. Like, for instance, I'm talking to a woman who has four children, and she's basically telling me that children can't have addictions because they're not old enough to be addicts, because they're not old enough to be properly socialized. They might have vices which are kind of selfish and take you away because children haven't been taught yet that you have to do everything with a group. And so her, you know, she was showing me the exact opposite of what we think in the United States, that addicts are immature. She was saying addicts are the ones who are mature because they have cultivated so many dependencies.
Your concept of bioethnography brings social together and life sciences. How did
Mhm.
this approach influence the way you studied addiction in this book?
Yeah. So this book got its start because I was working with environmental health scientists in Mexico City, and I was trying to understand how they kind of study chemical exposure. And then I was living in neighborhoods where many of their research participants lived. So they run, these environmental health scientists run a environmental health study that follows women and children over the course of their lives to see what is the impact of different kinds of chemical exposures on various kinds of developmental milestones or health impacts. And when I started living in the neighborhoods, I realized that my neighbors had a very different sense of chemical exposure, but they also had a very different sense of addiction. And most of my work now is really about how we can bring together ethnographic understandings of exposure or social science understandings of exposure, kind of taken from or understood through my neighbors, and put it in conversation with the way that environmental health experts measure, understand, try to mitigate exposure. And that's what I mean by bioethnography, bringing methods from the life sciences, the bios, the life sciences, and ethnographic methods together to be able to ask and answer kind of more complete questions about chemical exposure. This book, In Praise of Addiction, I wouldn't say it's exactly bioethnographic. I'm not bringing together life science data in relation with social science data or ethnographic data. I think it would be possible, and probably someone has done what we could think of as a bioethnographic study of addiction or people's relationship to substances, where you were both understanding using biological or life science methods to understand the impact of substances, for instance, as well as using ethnography to help us ask the right questions or to illuminate what the experience of, say, that substance was, and bring those kinds of understandings together for a more comprehensive way. But that's not what this book is. I would say, though, the book was really, it came into being because I was trying to do bioethnographic work in doing ethnography in these neighborhoods. And I hope to do bioethnographic work about addiction and dependency in the future. And in fact, a lot of my work about chemical exposure, I think we can see in a very similar light that I'm bringing knowledge of chemicals together through these life science techniques and these ethnographic techniques.
Professor, the book invites us to move away from shame and self-loathing. What would a more compassionate collective response to addiction look like in society?
Yeah, that's what I hope happens. I think so. One of the main things that I do in the book is narrate a change in my relationship to my sister. So, my sister was an alcoholic, or if you're in AA, you would say she's always an alcoholic. People have different theories and definitions of alcoholism, just like they have different theories of addiction. But I spent so much of my life trying to put her somewhere else, like cast her out or isolate her for her alcoholism. And I started being more in connection with her when she stopped drinking. But I was able to see through my work in Mexico City that the reason likely she was so abusive to me is because I kept isolating her. And I wondered, what would have happened if I didn't isolate her for her drinking early on? Would that have created a different way that we could have related that would have allowed her to, um, have a different relationship with me, maybe also to alcohol? I don't know. But then when she stopped drinking, I started realizing that she was still constantly shamed by many people in her world for taking prescription medications, in her case, benzodiazepines, that help her manage panic. Um, she's diagnosed with panic disorder, and panic attacks really impacted her life, most of her adult life. And so, even though she had stopped doing this thing that everyone thought she should do, like stop drinking, the fact that she used medications and, in fact, was dependent on these medications to help her get through her day, people kept saying, "You're an addict, and that's a problem, and you need to stop taking those medications." And what I narrate throughout the book is how I was with her as she was constantly shamed for using these medications, as I became increasingly kind of attuned to the way that we shame people for their dependencies. And I started wondering more and more, what if we didn't shame her for her dependency? We said, these are drugs that help you. They might have side effects in the long run, but so do all the other medications that we take. They all have side effects. Why is it such a problem that she is dependent on these medications? And so, what I do throughout, like the long arc of the book, is just to try to say, what if we stopped being so sure that dependency is itself a problem. And then how does that change our relationship to other people and to ourselves? Like, why is it a problem that she needs, is dependent on Klonopin or a benzodiazepine? And when I would ask medical professionals about this, they would say, well, it's an addiction because she's dependent. And it was like, but what's the problem with the dependency? And they often just didn't have a great answer. Sometimes, again, they would refer to the fact that there might be long-term effects with taking a medication like benzodiazepines. But again, most blood pressure medications or medications for heart disease, all these things have long-term health effects. And we don't shame people for taking them. So it feels like there's something about our fears about psychotropic medications or any substances that helps us emotionally or mentally, that this is a problem, that we shouldn't need this thing. And what I'm hoping for is that the book, if people can read the whole book and get to the end where, Anne Marie and I, my sister, Annie and I, were able to kind of shift our relationship to dependencies and instead claim I'm dependent on a lot of things. And those dependencies actually bring me great pleasure and joy. They help me manage my life. They help me go on, and they might have negative effects. We might have more compassion for ourselves and others, but we might be able to ask a new question. Instead of like, how can we leave our addictions behind? We could ask, to what shall we be addicted? Like, what are the addictions that actually promote more thriving, more ways to be in the world, more connections with ourselves and other people? And so that's kind of what I'm hoping most of all that will come out of this book.
Professor, how do harm reduction movements and perspective from anthropology, religion, and philosophy reshape our moral judgments around addiction?
How do they what about addiction?
Yeah. How do harm reduction movements and perspectives from anthropology, religion, and philosophy reshape our moral judgments around addiction?
Great. So harm reduction is, it's not one thing. Like everything isn't one thing. Recovery movements are not one thing. Feminist anthropology is not one thing. Anthropology is not one thing. Harm reduction is not one thing. But what harm reduction, kind of a loose definition, is attempts to try to alleviate the harms of drug taking. And that does not mean to alleviate the harms of taking drugs. It's to alleviate the harms of all of the kind of consequences of how we have criminalized drug taking in the United States. And in harm reduction kind of arose in the United States, but more in Western Europe and in Canada. And it's a movement to destigmatize drug use in many ways, but also to kind of reverse the effects of criminalization. So instead of saying people must stop taking drugs, it's saying like, oh, one of the harms of drug taking when it's illegal is that people share needles because there's so few needles, and they might be more likely to get hepatitis C. So could we have a needle exchange program where people are able to use clean needles when they inject opioids, for instance, and not get hepatitis C? Another kind of practice in harm reduction is to create what's called safe use sites, which is allowing people to do opioids with other people around, which dramatically reduces overdose death. So these are not to necessarily prevent people from taking drugs, but to prevent the harms that are associated with criminalization, and the kind of shaming we have around dependency. And there's multiple kinds of approaches to harm reduction. And I'm sure if someone's listening and is involved in harm reduction, they might disagree with some of my characterization here. And I think that these movements are incredibly powerful, but often, and especially recently, they come under a lot of criticism. So, for instance, there's been a big move to try to shut down safe use sites, saying that crime goes up around these areas, around in areas around safe use sites. All studies have shown that that's absolutely not the case. But saying that safe use sites actually, bring crime is a way to again, stigmatize drug users and to use the stigma we have about drug use as a way to shut down kind of more just or more healthy ways of, allowing drug use or promoting drug use in the world. I would say that what a lot of critical social sciences do as well, like anthropology you brought up, also hopefully work to kind of alleviate stigma around addiction by getting us to think very critically about why it is that we are sure that this is a problem. And what anthropology is it's a critical, it's a way of comparing the reader to other people and saying people around the world do things differently. And we probably can't do things exactly the same because our ecologies are different. But why are we so sure this is the only way to do something, the right way to do something, the natural way to do something? And I would say that's the project of anthropology in many ways, to allow us to see that there could be many ways that people approach problems that all of us kind of deal with or issues all of us deal with, but especially, for instance, in the realm of addiction, addiction was never even really considered a problem until the late 19th century. And before that was often considered a form of devotion, which is something that, I think we could learn a lot from.
Professor, before we wrap up, one final question for you. At a personal level, how has this reframing of addiction changed the way you relate to your own habits,
Yeah.
relationships, and forms of dependency?
Yeah, so I'll give a specific example of that. I mean, for years I was a binge eater and really was ashamed of the way that I ate and related to food and was constantly trying to restrict and control the way I eat food. And I especially had a very fraught relationship with sugar. I love sugar. It's like one of my favorite things in the world. Um, and that might not sound, as harmful or problematic as like loving heroin, for instance. But we're told we shouldn't be out of control in relation to things and that sugar is harmful. But my own relationship to sugar was harmful because I would stop eating it and I just couldn't, I would start eating it and I could not stop. And so this is something that I must control in all ways. And over the course of the book, I describe how my neighbors showing me that addiction could potentially be devotional allowed me to start a practice that I call sugar every day. And it means that it's not that I can have sugar every day, it's that I must have sugar every day. It's like a religious commandment. It's and that has radically rechanged my relationship to sugar. Instead of saying I shouldn't eat sugar or I can only get to have sugar once a month or once a week, but then once I have it once a week, I start, eating all the sugar. I now have this practice where I must have sugar every day. I could have it more than once a day, but no matter what, I have to have it once a day. And it ends up being something that I really look forward to and I'm very excited about. And I feel very, very taken care of. It also means that because I have it every day, I don't end up going out of control. Like I do, and I'm not saying going out of control is a problem because sometimes what we want is not feeling in control. Like I often I'm out of control now with food and I'm like, oh, that was exciting because I'm devoted to feeling out of control. But my relationship to sugar has really become something that I cherish and I adore. And I think that there's some similarities between that and harm reduction programs that have started in places like in Western Europe, like for instance in Switzerland, there's been programs that have given heroin addicts access to heroin every day. And it means that they still get heroin, this thing that they are addicted to, probably I would say devoted to, but they end up having much calmer lives. They hold jobs, they're with their families because they know that they're going to get the heroin every day that they need to sustain themselves. And I think some people would say they shouldn't have the heroin, just like some people would say I shouldn't have the sugar because no amount of sugar is good for you. But this is a thing that brings enormous pleasure. I can't speak for the heroin users, but I imagine it brings enormous pleasure. And I think that this, like, instead of trying to cast it out, I'm going to almost build an altar to sugar, or potentially a heroin user could build an altar to heroin and be like, it's going to be part of my devotional practice every day. I think really is quite a different mode of relating to the things that beguile us, that consume us, that we are dependent on. So that's a big practice that changed in relation to my writing this book.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Roberts. Her work invites us to rethink addiction not as a personal falling, but as a deeply human experience shaped by connection, context, and care. If this episode resonates with you, we encourage you to explore in praise of addiction and continue reflecting on the ways dependency shape our lives. Until next time, stay curious and take care. Thank you, Professor Elizabeth, for joining us and sharing such powerful insights from your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me and asking such great questions. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.